Welcome back, everybody. In today's video, I want to show you this very clean one owner example of a 93 Mitsubishi Montero. Now, this is an interesting one because this is kind of a hybrid between the Gen 1 and the Gen 2. So back here, I have a Gen 1 short wheelbase. That's an 84. This one's a 95 Montero. And this is the Gen 2, Gen 1 crossover right here. So this was made in 93, but they also did this in 92. And it's got some of the bits from the Gen 1 and a lot of the bits from the Gen 2. So let me take you on a tour of this thing and show you exactly what I mean. So at first glance, this is obviously a Gen 2 body style. It's going to be the Gen 2 LS for most of us. That's what we're more familiar with, where it doesn't have the plastic fender flares like the SR does. But it's going to have the same body style as a lot of the later Gen 2s, but this is an earlier one. The grill's the same, the bumper's the same, everything underneath is the same as far as the frame, the suspension, the sway bars, all of that stuff is the same. I'm pretty sure that the rear axle is also the same in the back of this. Instead of having the leaf springs, you've got the coil springs in all of these. These never came with that. And then it's also got the gas tank from this model. And so everything is a Gen 2 as far as what you can see. The tail lights are interchangeable. The headlights are interchangeable. A lot of the molding is interchangeable. So on the outside, it looks just like a normal Gen 2. Now it is the RS version, which is confusing because there's the RS and then there's the SR and then there's the LS. And this is the basic model of this. And so there's a few things that were kind of shifting back and forth as they worked with this kind of model year. The biggest one that you'll notice, it has cloth seats in there. Cloth seats, no sunroof. That's what's going to come on the RS model. But other than that, if you didn't know, you'd look at this and you'd say, this is just a standard Gen 2. The biggest differences happen when you get inside and when you get under the hood. So let's jump inside and I'll show you what it looks like from the driver's seat. So coming around to the driver's side, you can see it's got the manual seats and it's got the cloth. And this one's actually in really good condition. Like I mentioned before, this is a single owner car. And so it's been really well kept. This one's got the very blue interior. Everything is some kind of shade of blue. And when you get in, there's a lot of similarities. This gauge cluster is the exact same as other Gen 2 models. So it has all the same things on it, even coming down to the lights. All of that is the same in the middle. The switch panel on this side, the door handles, all of this stuff is the same. The mirrors, they're the same. And then you get into the center here, and that's when things get a little bit different. One of the biggest differences is going to be this inclinometer, which is kind of gimmicky, as it says right here. Inclinometer is only accurate when you're completely stopped, and even then it rocks back and forth. But this is a fun little thing to have. On the other Gen 2 models, like my SR, this is a compass, but it's got your oil pressure and it's got your battery voltage. It's in the same housing as later Gen 2s, but it comes with that. Coming down here, this is all standard Gen 2 stuff. So they completely moved over and all of this stuff is exactly the same. But you'll see that this one comes with a manual transmission. And this one comes with the same manual transmission that's in the Gen 1. So if you had a Gen 1 that was a 6-cylinder, then you had this transmission in it. So this transmission is different than the later years it came with. And this one's pretty bulletproof. And I won't get under the car to show you exactly what that looks like. It looks like a standard Gen 1 V6 transmission. It's a good solid transmission. This one seems to be really reliable. However, it does have a different transfer case. So the Gen 1s had a transfer case that went behind it that did 2 high, 4 high locked center, and 4 low. But this one offers the all-wheel drive version, also known as 4 high. So what that does is it engages a limited slip between the front and rear wheels, and it's awesome for the snow. It's one of my favorite features of the Gen 2 and Gen 3 Monteros is having that. And so if you want that old school feel, if you want a manual transmission, if you want these fun gauges, but you want to have some of the safety of being able to actually put this thing in all-wheel drive for gravel roads or snowy conditions, this kind of hybrid Gen 1.5, 92 and 93, this is the perfect one. So this is a manual Transfer case, just like came in the later Gen 2s, manual transmission, but this one has the addition of that 4-high or all-wheel drive, and I think that's really sweet. Other things that are different about this is this center console area. So there's a few things that are different. One, it's got this little tray right here. That's nice for storing stuff. It's got a dish right here as well as here. But then this ashtray is different as well. It's just kind of fun. Normally the ashtray for the Gen 2 is right here. Not sure why it's different, but there's a little bit of difference there as far as the interior. And then it's got the cup holders like the other Gen 2s that they're always broken. That bar comes out. That bar is supposed to go right here, and it always falls out. But this one's in pretty good shape. And then, like I said, it does have the cloth seats, but these are the exact same bolt-in pattern as the other Gen 2s. Everything like that is the same. They use a different kind of cloth in later Gen 2s. This very much feels like an old school 90s SUV when you're inside of here. Now, moving into the rear, this is the most damage on the whole car, by the way, is just this guy, and it might be from a dog, I'm not 100% sure. But the seats in here are a little different. So this is another difference between the 92 and 93 Gen 2s and the later model Gen 2s. So you've got this old style seat, and this is reminiscent of what came in the Gen 1 long wheelbase. I believe it's the exact same seat. It might be a little bit different. It's gonna fold up and out of the way, just like the Gen 2 4-doors did. And then you don't have the option back here for that third row. All the other Monteros came with a third row, whether it's a Gen 3 that's folded into the floor or the Gen 2 and Gen 2.5s that come down from the side. This one, you don't have that option, but you can slide this forward. Like I said, very similar, if not exactly the same, as the 4-door Gen 1s that came right before this. And then this rear hatch, this rear door, all of this is exactly the same as the later Gen 2s. So another thing to point out is, yes, this does have automatic windows and automatic locking doors. So it's a little different than the other Gen 1s. The other thing that it has that's really cool, especially for a manual car, is it has cruise control. And the cruise control actually works. So you can set this thing in gear and you can hit the cruise control and it'll keep up with speed for you, which is really nice. It's a very common amenity nowadays, but to have that in an old school stick shift, that's pretty cool. The other thing I love about this one is it has a limited slip differential. Here's what I love about that. If you put this in all-wheel drive with the limited slip in snowy conditions like this, you are unstoppable. The thing is just locked up. It wants to drive really well in any kind of conditions, ice, snow, or otherwise. This is a great feature to have in an old school car like this that allows you to have modern day safety as far as the drivability in it. For example, I love my Gen 1, but it doesn't have any of those safety features, and so it gets really squirrely when you're driving on stuff like this because you have to either have it in 2-wheel drive or you have to have the whole thing locked up. It's just not nearly as safe as the Gen 3 or the Gen 2 when I have the option to put it in all-wheel drive. So that's really cool for this. Like I mentioned before, this definitely looks like a Gen 2 on the outside, but it's when you get inside and under the hood that you see the biggest differences. So let's pop the hood and I'll show you what we're working with in here. So for those of you familiar with Monteros, you'll recognize this motor right away. This is the 3-liter V6 out of the Gen 1. So this is a holdover motor before they went to the later 3.0s with 24 valves. This one only has 12 valves, or the 3.5s that were really common in these. This is the 3-liter non-interference V6. And this motor is not very impressive as far as power, but as far as reliability, it's hard to beat. It's non-interference, so you don't have to worry about snapping a timing belt. It's low compression, so it's not going to make a bunch of power, but it's also not going to do a bunch of damage. They seem to run forever. This one has 260,000 miles on it, and I actually just took this apart and I rebuilt it so that it'll go hopefully another 260,000 miles. The only things that were wrong with it, it had 2 cracked exhaust valves. Other than that, it was still running. It doesn't appear to be burning oil. It's in great shape. So this is the old school motor. The nice thing about it is electronic fuel injection. So I've been starting this thing in -10-degree weather all winter, and it's doing just fine. I'm not fiddling with a carburetor like I am with the 4 cylinders. In those guys, it'll just fire up. It'll run at elevation. It'll run up and down in temperature. It's no problem at all. So in a lot of ways, it's an old school motor with just enough amenity, just enough modernness to keep it relevant on the road today. So pretty much everything under the hood here is exactly like you'd find it in a long wheelbase or even a short wheelbase if it came equipped with it. V6 first gen Montero. And so this is all the same, all the way down to the transmission. Like I said, once you get to the transfer case, that's when things start getting different. But this power plant is a holdover from the earlier Gen 1s. And so some people, like I said, this is more desirable because it's kind of idiot proof. It doesn't do anything super impressive, but it will last basically forever. They're easy to work on. There's enough parts for them that you can really keep them on the road. And so that's a pretty cool advantage. Also, I find that these burn less oil than the later motors. It has less valve stem seals and therefore just less spots to leak. Every other Montero that I've had has quite a bit of issue burning oil from the valve stem seals. This one I find lasts a little bit longer. So if you're willing to be a little bit slower, and it's worth noting, this is actually a bigger car than the Gen 1, and so it's gonna be heavier, therefore it's gonna be a little bit slower than even maybe its Gen 1 competitors. If you're willing to put up with that for longevity and simplicity, this is a pretty good option for you. Now, before we get too much further, I know some of you are going to be asking about wheels and tires, and these are just some wheels and tires that I picked up on Facebook Marketplace, and I actually don't know the specs as far as the offset of the wheel, but I will tell you these are 31 by 10.5 on 15s, and they look awesome. This is no lift. I haven't even adjusted the torsion bars, haven't done anything in the rear. I've just got good shocks in it, and this thing looks and rides amazing. You can see it's just barely sticking out past the fender flares, and I think it looks amazing. This is the best combination, 31 10.5 with a little bit of offset. This is the best combination for a stock Montero that's not going to be lifted or anything, just a little more poke, just a little more meat. I think it looks the business. Now, driving this thing around, it feels and looks just like any other Gen 2 because the interior, like I said, is mostly the same from this vantage point other than the gauges. It looks like a Gen 2, it drives like a Gen 2, it handles like a Gen 2. Honestly, if you didn't know that it had the older motor in here, you might not even notice that it was a little less on power. That being said, it keeps up with traffic just fine. I've driven a lot of other Gen 2s and Gen 1s, and the four-door version, they are pretty slow, especially when you get them loaded up. And this one's empty right now, but I'm easily able to cruise at 55 miles an hour. One thing I have noticed though is the RPMs are pretty high. So when I'm at highway speeds, I'm well over 3,000 RPM. By the time I get to about 60, 65, I'm already pretty high up there, but it doesn't seem to matter at all to this thing. It's happy as a clam. And like I said, it's a little bit down on power, but because it's EFI, it seems to do okay. Another thing that's interesting is the steering wheel controls. These seem to be unique to this year. So the 92 and 93, where you have a limited amount of things on this stock as far as the windshield wiper controls, and then right behind it, you've got the button right there for the rear windshield wiper. And then over here on this stock, you have your turn signals, obviously, and your headlights, versus the other Gen 2 has different stocks and the Gen 1 has different stocks as well. So it seems like a weird crossover thing that they did just for this year. This one is also missing two safety features that most people, I think, would say are an advantage to have, and this just doesn't have it. They're carryovers from the Gen 1. It's missing any kind of airbags, and it doesn't have any kind of ABS. So the Gen 1s, they didn't have airbags, and the Gen 2s, they almost all had ABS and airbags. This one, although it's a Gen 2 body style, doesn't have either. So it's completely manual, and you just die like a real man with your face going through the dashboard, if you're into that. But that's an interesting thing as well, is even though they had started to transfer over the body, they hadn't done the engineering to figure out how to put an airbag in just even on the driver's side, and ABS wasn't enough of a thing. So I find that curious, but obviously they added it later. Another thing I'll say about the driving experience of this versus other Gen 1s is this car is smooth. Now, this is obviously a really good example because it's been a one-owner car and it's really well kept, and it has like a freshly rebuilt motor in it. But this thing is way smoother than other Gen 1s that I've been in with the similar drivetrain. I think part of it is the suspension is just better in a Gen 2, it's more comfortable. But then also, I think there's quite a bit more sound deadening and dampening and a lot more NVH consideration in something like a Gen 2 versus a Gen 1. Gen 1 was pretty rudimentary, and some people really like that. But this is a car, man, I could spend hours and hours in here. It's quiet, it's smooth, it shifts great. That's something that has really stood out to me about this one. Same drivetrain as other Gen 1s, but it seems way smoother, way more quiet, way more friendly inside than the previous generation. So like I mentioned, this is actually a one owner car, and I bought it, but I'm actually selling it back to the original owner. Here's the story with that. So somebody reached out to me when they found out that I had Monteros. They stopped me at a gas station and said, hey, is that a Montero? And they started sharing their story of how they've got a Montero and they love it, but it's not running quite right. And we went back and forth, and eventually she reached out and said, hey, it's time for me to part with this thing. I don't know if I can afford to fix it. I want to sell it to you because I know you'll take care of it. So I jumped on the opportunity because it's so clean. It's got every service record since new. And she said, hey, I want you to have this thing, but if and when you get it back on the road and you decide to sell it, I call first dibs on buying it back. So sure enough, I took the motor out, I rebuilt it. I've been daily driving it for the last month. It's running mint. And I reached out to her and said, hey, here's what I've done. Are you interested in buying it back? And she said, absolutely. I've got to have that back in my life. And so the original owner is actually buying it back from me. And to me, that's almost just as cool as me keeping it in the fleet, because she loves this thing. And it was just such a bummer when she lost 2 cylinders due to those burnt exhaust valves. She couldn't drive it anymore and she didn't know what to do. And so for me to come in and fix it up and get it back on the road running perfect to give to her, that's something that's really rad. So there you go, guys. I just want to give you a tour of this because, one, it's a very cool example, and I think it's just an interesting crossover between the Gen 1 and the Gen 2. Some of these in-between years, sometimes people think it has all the features that I want, it has all of the old school that I want, and some of the modern amenities, and it's perfect. Some people, it's kind of the worst of both worlds. But there's this one, and then there's the Gen 2.5, which I hope to do a review of later and show you guys how it kind of blends the Gen 2 and the Gen 3. But because I had the opportunity, I wanted to show this to you guys. So hopefully you've enjoyed this. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them down below, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.